I'm going to talk about how AI might change ethics. I will actually try to be brief and leave plenty of time for questions and discussion, because my main goal really is to stimulate discussion, I think, on issues and aspects of AI and ethics that unfortunately have not received enough attention. So AI ethics has received an enormous amount of attention recently. And that's a great thing, because AI does raise a host of very important and deep ethical issues. But unfortunately, I think the discussion so far, or at least the discussion in recent years, to be more precise, has been very focused on what is really a very small subset of the relevant things. And in particular, I think there's a point of view, there's something that I think has been sorely missing, which is the realization that the interaction between AI and ethics is a two-way street, right? Almost all of the discussion that we've seen of AI ethics to date is about fitting AI one way or another into the existing ethical norms. But this misses the point that the interaction between AI and ethics, just like the interaction between technology and society in general, is a two-way street. AI is going to change society. And as a result, it's also going to change the ethical norms of society. And I think it really behooves us to start thinking about what that's going to look like. I think it would be extremely naive to think that the society of 50 or 100 years from now, after AI has brought about all these changes, will look just like the current one, except with AI. We know from history that that's not what happens. To take one example, think of the pill, right? That one invention dramatically changed sexual mores. Or to take another, very famous example, think of the printing press, right? The printing press was one invention that dramatically changed society. And we can imagine, Catholic clergy back then discussing this new invention and thinking and saying things like, oh yeah, this is great. This will save scribes a lot of labor. But we have to make sure that Bibles don't fall into the hands of the people. And now, of course, we know what happened. It's that Bibles did very much fall into the hands of the people. And that led to the Reformation, among other things. It led to Protestantism. It led to decades of wars and conflict. And it led to societies that were and are organized around different lines from the ones that we had then, right? So in particular, for example, America is a society that is organized along Protestant rather than Catholic lines. So I hope that we are not making the same mistake today, looking at AI through a very narrow funnel and really missing what the important changes are going to be. And we don't know what they are, but I think it's very important to at least speculate about them and start getting ready for them. Because if we don't, there's a bigger risk that things will go, that changes will be for the worse rather than for the better. So, if you believe Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, AI is more profound than electricity or fire. So even the changes that were brought about by the pill or the printing press or many others will be dwarfed by the changes that AI will bring about. Now, of course, this could be a gross exaggeration, but even if it isn't, I think we still need to think about how AI is going to change the outlook of society, and therefore also the ethical principles and notions that are the outgrowth of society. Now, of course, this is not an easy thing to do, because our belief in our moral and ethical principles is so strong that it's almost impossible to see outside of them. Right? I mean, think, for example, of how we now look at the people of the 19th century and how unbelievably racist and sexist they were. Right? And now think of the people of 100 years from now looking back at us, right? We think, what were those people in the 19th century thinking? How could they have been so wrong? And the people of 100 years from now probably will also think, well, those people of 100 years ago, like, what the heck were they thinking, right? So, let's start thinking, forward to try to imagine what that might be and have what I think are the real debates to be had about ethics rather than debates about, the past ethics and, things that the ethics that we have today evolved from a certain set of economic and technological factors, and we shouldn't confuse those for the ones that are now going to emerge. Now, of course, AI is a particularly, you could say, either rich or troublesome technology from this point of view, because AI is so broad in what it can do. I mean, it's the automation of intelligence, right? And so broad in the implications that it can have, right? It's like what Donald Rumsfeld famously called a target-rich environment. AI is almost like a canvas onto which we can project whatever preoccupies us, right? It's almost like a Rorschach test. What you see in AI is whatever is in your mind rather than what AI really is. So as an example, Westerners who are raised on the Bible and the creation myth of the Genesis are very obsessed with this notion of the creation rebelling against the creator, right? There's, in the culture from, Hollywood movies to literature to the, serious discussions of AI ethics, there's a lot of this question of like, well, what if AI revolts against us, right? Now, contrast that, for example, with the Japanese who, being more influenced by the Shinto religion, just see robots as friendly creatures and treat them as such. They don't worry about the creation rebelling against the creator. And, also not by accident, they are, much farther ahead in robotics in many ways than places like America and Europe. As another example, if you're a liberal, you probably worry a liberal, in the American sense of liberal, so a progressive, not in the classical liberal sense that is more common in say, Europe. You are probably very concerned with things like fairness and equality and equity and so on. And liberals today, what they project onto AI is bias and discrimination, right? They see an enormous potential for bias and discrimination in AI, and that's what has them all worked up. If you're a libertarian, on the other hand, your biggest concern is freedom. And what you're really worked up about is that AI is the new big brother. AI is going to be, oppression, on a scale perhaps that we've never seen before. And it's not like these are not valid concerns coming from whatever quadrant. They are valid. But the problem is that they're a very small fraction of all the relevant concerns, and they also perhaps transitory concerns. So let's try to think about how this will look for those people of 50 to 100 years from now. And of course, in doing that, we can take inspiration from history and economics and sociology and psychology, right? We can, I think, as Churchill said, use our knowledge of the past to try and see the future better, right? And, take what I'm going to talk about as speculation, right? I'm not saying that things are going to be like this, let alone saying that they should be like this. I'm just saying that these are things that we should be thinking about, both in the content and in the point of view. So let's look at a few of, in the time that we have, just a few of the more salient things. So one very, very salient thing these days related to AI is privacy, right? So a lot of people are very concerned about the dangers to AI, to privacy that AI brings, right? Now, this is interesting. I mean, for example, in Europe, right, privacy is a right enshrined in the Constitution, and there's the general, data protection regulation that has very draconian protections of privacy that have put an enormous burden on a lot of people for arguably very little gain. Both on individuals and on companies and so on. And if you take a longer historical perspective of this, it's actually quite curious because privacy as such is actually a very recent concept. In that form, people really only introduced privacy in the late 19th century. And it was mostly, politicians and people in the private sphere that promoted it because they felt they needed their private lives protected. The common people never had much need or use for privacy. In fact, in the village and the tribe, there was no such thing as privacy. And in fact, there are those who say that in the global village, once again, there is no such thing as privacy. And here, as in many other of these issues, we also see an interesting generational divide. The older generations worry a lot about privacy. The younger generations, not really. They just don't think about it. Like they will live their lives on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok in public, and that's the more public the better in many ways, right? So there's clearly a difference of points of view on this, right? Now, we worry, more specifically about things like, the tech giants and other companies, but mainly the tech giants. They harvest our data. They spy on us, so-called surveillance capitalism. And then they use that data mining to manipulate us, right? This is the way people, very much look at things these days. There's this saying that you've probably heard that if the product is free, you are the product, right? And this is actually a very fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on here. This is zero-sum thing, right? The use of data by these companies to go into the machine learning and the AI and then recommend things to you or modify, whatever, interface you're using is not a zero-sum game. It is very much, a positive sum game where both you and the tech company and whatever, the seller of, the buyer of the ad, seller of goods can benefit. For example, consider the following. It's easy to estimate, from, say, Google's annual revenue and the number of users, what the average annual revenue per user is. And what you get out of this is that my value to Google per year is in the tens of dollars. Okay, so that's what I'm worth to Google. Now, how much is Google, for example, just the search engine, how much is Google worth to me? Well, there was a recent survey done by folks at MIT that the estimate that came out of it is that Google, to the average user, is worth $17,000 a year. So Google is worth 1,000 times more to me than I am to it, right? Now, of course, you could just say like, no, I don't want to be the product. I want to keep all my data very secret and then the lock and key. And you're entitled to do that. But it's, why would you want to do that, right? It's like the Amish, right? The Amish don't like, modern technology and, they're free to not like it. But the bottom line is, very, very few people choose to be Amish. And I think it's going to be the same thing with privacy. Here's another very important aspect of this that I think has gotten, shockingly very little attention, honestly, which is data sharing can actually be an ethical duty. For example, I've heard medical researchers say that with enough data, we can cure cancer by using that data to build models of cells and tumors and so on. And without enough data, we can't cure cancer. So if that is the case, then every cancer patient has the ethical duty to share data. It would be selfish to not do so. Not to mention, you might benefit from sharing your data for the next time if you have cancer or your family members and so on. But just from the point of view of social good, you have the duty to share data. And this, what is true of cancer is also true of healthcare from top to bottom. In fact, social science has the potential to just become a much better, more mature science than it ever was by using the data, by finally having data that is an amount of data that is commensurate with the complexity of the phenomena that it's studying, right? Physics could do that 300 years ago because the phenomena are very simple. And then, today, maybe biology is different here. But with data, social science can just become better. And then the decisions that we make based on our understanding of society can also be better. Evidence-based policy is better policy. So I think that, if you look forward, maybe even just a decade or two, we will get to a point where if you are a person living in a very data-rich society, but you choose to not share your data, you will be viewed as a free rider and be penalized accordingly. So, this is one thing that I think maybe we need to start thinking more about. Here's another big one: fairness and equality. This is very much to the fore these days. And, there's, you could do a whole talk about this. So let me just take one issue that I think is representative. In many countries today, there are laws forbidding the use of some kinds of information in decision-making. For example, forbidding the use of sex and gender. Of sex and race or race and gender. And if you think about it, this is a little odd because it contradicts one of the basic principles of rational decision-making, which is that you should use all the available information. If you make decisions without using all the available information, they're potentially the wrong decision, and making the wrong decision is irrational and arguably even unethical. Now, you might say, well, the reason you can't use things like, race and gender in decisions like, for example, credit scoring or, job or hiring, et cetera, is that they are irrelevant. But this can't be the answer, because whether or not certain variables are irrelevant to certain decisions is an empirical question. And empirical questions can't be decided by law, right? Hume famously said that you can't derive an ought from the is, but the converse is also true. You can't derive an is from an ought, right? I think that the real answer that laws like this exist is that there's a presumption that those variables will be misused. And that presumption, is based on a lot of historical experience, obviously, and maybe it's a correct assumption for humans. But the point, however, is that just because assuming it's a correct assumption for humans, even today, that doesn't mean that it's a correct assumption for algorithms, for AI. For example, does the equation y equals ax plus b have race and gender biases? Well, obviously not, right? That equation doesn't know anything about sociological variables like that. But a machine learning algorithm is just a more complex form of such an equation. So it can't know it doesn't know about those things either. And yet we talk about machine learning algorithms all the time in both research and the media and in, policy making, as if it has those biases, right? We sometimes call this the homunculus fallacy. It's this notion that inside an AI, there's a little man pulling levers. But that is clearly not what is going on. And now we can ask ourselves, well, why if it is the case that we should not or cannot assume a priori that AI is going to have these, bad uses of these variables, then why are we forbidding them, right? Maybe the laws should be revised, right? There's a lot of laws that were made with only humans in mind that now have to be revised for the fact that a lot of these decisions are now made by machines. But, one thing that I haven't seen considered is this fact that a lot of these, things like, for example, redlining laws, right? Redlining laws actually forbid things like using variables like your postal code to make decisions about, let's say, for example, granting loans, because they are correlated with race. Again, the historical reason for this is that in the past, when the use of race was forbidden, then some lenders started using it as a proxy for race, right? But that was in 1960-something. Today, right, when a machine learning algorithm finds a correlation between, zip code and likelihood of repaying your loan, there is nothing racist about that. The correlation is real. So why is the machine learning algorithm forbidden to use that? And in fact, if you follow this logic, at the end of the day, everything is correlated with everything. So if you really are intent on applying those laws like redlining laws, then you can't do machine learning because everything is correlated with everything else. And this is particularly perverse because if what you want to do is make, for example, loan or policing or you name it, hiring decisions independent of variables like race and gender, while making them the best decision you can, actually using these variables via conditional independence actually can potentially make them independent. So if that's what you care about is not discriminating on the basis of race, gender, etc., you should be using these variables, not forbidding their use. Now, of course, these are issues that people feel very passionately about. And there are many people who will never come around to the notion that you should be able to use these variables. But, what's going to happen, this is what usually happens with technology, is that as its use becomes normalized and we start, escaping from that homunculus fallacy and no longer seeing, AI as just being miniature humans with all their biases, people will start asking this question: why are we not allowed to use these variables? And finally, they will, once these people are in the majority, at least in a democracy, they will pass laws saying, well, you have to use those variables. And, I think there's a very good chance that will come to pass. And, we'll see. So here's another one. We see a lot of worry. This is, one of the, top few favorite themes, AI-related themes in the media, if you will. And it's also something that a lot of serious economists worry a lot about, is that AI will be the end of work. And since work is what gives life meaning, this is going to be very bad. Right? Now, I don't think that AI is going to be the end of work anytime soon. But in the longer term, it's quite possible that we will get to the point where AIs can do every job that humans do better and more cheaply, and then it will be the end of work. So let's think for just a second about what that would mean, right? And here's one datum I think worth bearing in mind. Studies of work have found that today, very broadly speaking, jobs tend to fall into two categories. One are jobs that people who do them don't like, so they don't like the job, they just do it for the money, or jobs in which people are overworked, right? You can choose which of those two you fall into. Probably for the people in this meeting, it's the second category. But the striking fact is that either way, people are not happy. And now if you contrast that with people who don't have to work, like, for example, retirees or people who are independently wealthy, those people tend to be happier. And now we can ask ourselves the question, is there a reason that couldn't happen at the level of a whole society if the technology allows it? I don't see why that couldn't happen, right? I think we could very well come to the point where actually people look back on our days in horror. They'll see work as a barbaric relic of the past. Think of those days when people were forced to earn money instead of spending their time on what actually gives life meaning. Wasn't that horrible? And surely it was just a case of self-delusion of people trying to come up with reasons why work was good, when in fact they just did it because they had to, right? Maybe 50 years from now or 100 years from now, this is how people will think. And I can imagine a future world in which instead of countries and governments worrying about the unemployment level being too high, they worry about the employment level being too high. Maybe America will worry that it's falling behind China because it still has more people who still have to work than China. China is further along the road of freeing people from that horrible thing of work. So that's another thing to give some thought to. Of course, in each of these things, I'm only kind of like glossing over the tip of the iceberg. You could have a whole discussion on these things, and we can, of course, during the question period, go whichever way we feel. But I think, again, I'm just trying to call attention to a lot of things that I think are worth thinking about. So here's another one. let me start with an example, right? So self-driving cars, another, thing that's very much on people's minds these days. If your self-driving car, for some reason, has malfunctioned and, the brakes don't work, and it's in danger of running over a bunch of children, should it instead swerve into a wall and kill the driver, right? This, of course, is just the AI version of a very well-known, type of thought experiment, if you will, which in fact there's a whole subfield, as many of you probably know, in philosophy, tongue-in-cheek, called trolleyology, of how to deal with these various ethical dilemmas where, in some sense, the rational thing to do seems to conflict with human intuition. And now these days, there's a whole subfield of, AI, self-driving car trolleyology. And the interesting thing about this is that even, from the point of view of just as humans, is that the fact that a lot of these decisions are now made by machines, which is new in history, actually is forcing us to confront certain things about how we humans make those decisions that may well change how we look at how we make them, and again, at how we have, ethical principles and follow them. So in particular, if you look at, the discussion on self-driving cars, it essentially has the flavor of, well, machines must follow these rules that we have for humans on the road, of course, right? The only question is how to make them do that. But there's a little problem here, which is, first of all, programming ethical rules into machines is never going to work, right? This is like, Asimov's, famous laws of robotics and his series of stories from, collected in iRobot, where essentially the point of every one of those stories is that it doesn't work, right? The robots will wind up always behaving in ways that those laws could not have predicted, right? Now, of course, these days we have machine learning, and you can say, instead of just programming these ethical rules in all their glorious ambiguity into the AIs, which is impossible, they can learn them by observing people, right? That's how AI is making great strides in many other areas. Well, the problem with that is, if you think about it, if an AI were to try to learn how to follow the rules of the road, or any ethical rules, if you will, from humans, it would be very confused. Because we humans claim to follow these rules, but in practice, we very often don't. In fact, if you've ever been in a self-driving car, you know that the typical experience is, at first, it's kind of weird that you're in a car that's driving itself. But within a few minutes, it just goes from being weird to being extremely boring. Because an AI, a self-driving car, is the most conservative driver you've ever seen. It very carefully follows all the rules, which nobody does. And as a result, among other things, human drivers take advantage of it left and right. So you're not going to have an effective self-driving car until it learns to bend or even break the rules just like humans do. And now an interesting conundrum arises, which is, if you have to do that, we're going to have to explicitly or implicitly program the machines to break the rules. At which point we have to face the fact that we are programming the machines to break the rules, and therefore we need to give up on the pretense that we believe in those rules, or that we believe that they should never be broken, right? So it's going to cause us, I think, to change the way we look at how these things work. So, hypocrisy, saying one thing and doing another, for better or worse, is one of the central ways in which societies work. But in a way, having intelligent machines, like, for example, self-driving cars, makes it untenable to have that hypocrisy. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but surely we're going to have to let the machines bend the rules just like we do. And either we're going to have to give up on that hypocrisy, or maybe, with our amazing creativity for these things, come up with some new kind of hypocrisy that lets us, let the machines do these things while pretending that we're not letting them, right? So, for example, one way in which this, could turn out, and is, being discussed, and even, there are very concrete proposals to do this, is that there will be laws that say, you shall kill the driver and not the 5 children. Right? And in fact, when you poll people, that have been posed with this, and you ask them a question in abstract terms, should the car kill fewer people or less? They're very much in favor of the ethical thing of saving the children. But then if you ask them when you're the driver, then they don't want then you don't want the car to kill you. So one as just a small example of how this could turn out is like, we could have laws that say, the car, should, kill the driver if it's the best thing to do, even against the will and the interests of the driver. And then the cars come from the factory with that AI installed. And then there's an aftermarket of modifications to the AI that everybody will use that actually override that and save the driver even at the expense of the children or whatever it might be. Okay. So another set of issues that I think is worth thinking about. So here's another one particularly prominent these days, unfortunately, and this is war and the role of AI in war, and in particular of intelligent weapons in their many forms. Now, the prevailing, moral view today, which I'm guessing probably all of us in this meeting share, is that war is hell and should be avoided at all costs. But again, if you take a historical perspective on this, you know that this is actually a recent phenomenon. Through most of history, war was a normal function of the state or the city or the tribe or what have you. And in fact, prior to World War I, countries had ministries of war. And it was only after the, terrible horror of that war that they changed their names to ministries of defense. They still do the same thing, except that calling them ministries of war is no longer kosher, so they're called ministries of defense because that sounds better. And also, like this expression itself, war is hell, right, was coined by William Sherman, the famous general from the American Civil War, who more than anyone else is responsible for inventing total war. Okay. But now here's the thing that we have to think about is that how does AI change this equation? If it's robots that are fighting, just to take the cartoon, if it's robots that are fighting the war and not humans, now the level of horror is different, right? It's a waste, but it's not people being killed. So our moral view of war may well change again. And, we can debate what's good and bad about that and what we should, how we should think about it then. But my point is that, our thinking about, what war should be and how it should be fought or not will probably change as well. And this is not just an abstract question for the long-term future. There are, intelligent weapons already being used today. And their intelligence is rapidly increasing. And how much autonomy they should have is a very salient question. In fact, there's a movement that has made, a good bit of progress. And there's, debates ongoing at the United Nations to have something like a Geneva Convention forbidding the use of intelligent weapons. And the analogy here is with, the explicit driving analogy is with weapons of mass destruction. Biological, chemical, nuclear weapons. So for the same reason that we made those illegal, at least to various degrees, we should do the same thing with intelligent weapons. But if you think about it, this is actually a very odd analogy because weapons of mass destruction are so called because they kill indiscriminately. That's what makes them so evil. But the whole point of intelligent weapons is that they kill very discriminately. They can actually be better than humans at saving the lives of bystanders by being more precise and careful about, where to shoot and when and how. So intelligent weapons save lives. And if we outlaw them, we actually risk killing people. And again, this is not abstract. Just think, for example, of the 2 Iraq wars. Actually, in the second, there are a lot of Iraqis that are alive today, probably, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, because America in the Second War, for the first time, used laser-guided bombs, as opposed to the indiscriminate bombing that it used in all previous wars, including the first Iraq war. So many fewer people died because the weapons were now more intelligent. Or think, for example, of the Reuters journalists, right? There was a team of a journalist and a cameraman that were killed in Iraq by an American, helicopter because they confused their video camera with a missile launcher. And so they shot them. They shot a missile at them that killed them. If instead of humans, we had an AI there, that I could very well have been more discriminating and go like, no, that actually is a video camera. And those journalists might still be alive today. And another aspect of this is that every soldier that you replace by a robot or by an automated system of some form is one less human in harm's way. And also, if the decisions are made by an AI, they are not made in fear. They are not made in anger. They can be less clouded by the fog of war. Fewer mistakes will be made of all kinds, saving lives on both sides. So maybe if we are going to have a Geneva Convention, right, what we should have is a Geneva Convention forbidding humans in combat, not machines. Here's another one, also a very salient one these days. And this is the contest between democracy and authoritarianism and how AI plays into it. Now, the contest between democracy and
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
So the contest between democracy and authoritarianism is a very old one. And, at some point, some people in the West had the illusion that that contest was over, but it's clearly not. And the question is how, there was this notion that democracy will win in the end. It's inevitable. And I think that notion is now a little shaky, to say the least. But, from the point of view of AI, the salient question is, how does AI change, or how can AI change the relative strengths of democracy and authoritarianism? And it's not a given that it favors one or the other. It really depends on what each of them does with it. In fact, I think something that we appreciate very well today that did not, 20 or even 10 years ago, is that AI is an amazing tool for authoritarians. Right? George Orwell, if he knew AI, he would have Big Brother on a whole different scale, right? AI is like, if you want to use it for surveillance and repression, it's the ultimate tool. And this is very scary, right? Now, on the other hand, AI can also be a great tool for democracy. It can also be a great tool for resisting authoritarianism. But we have to develop those uses, right? AI can, like any technology, AI gives power. It's a question of how it's used. AI can be used to perfect authoritarianism. It can also be used to perfect democracy. And unfortunately, so far, democracy is behind in this game, right? In democracies, we are mostly arguing about like how to, repress AI and restrict it and avoid this and that and the other. We're not thinking in terms of like, how can we make democratic processes function better by using AI? Now, to be fair, and this is a very good thing, there's a lot of research on how to use AI, in various ways and at various levels, from, cities to parties to what have you. None of this has really caught on yet, but I think sooner or later it will, and it has to. Because if you think about it, the way democracy works today is incredibly outdated. In a democracy today, today as a consumer, you send megabytes of information to the producers, every day. And how many, bytes of information do you send to your representatives, right? To the people who govern you? A few bytes a year when you vote on your ballot by putting in a few crosses. This made sense in 1787 when, the set of algorithms that we call, for example, the US Constitution was drawn up, right? That's what they could do then. But today we are so far beyond that. But we're still using this very simple algorithm, which is what it is, right? to make decisions, which is everybody votes. Whoever has the most votes becomes a representative, and then the representatives in turn have a discussion, and then they vote. Right? I mean, this is not terrible, right? We've gotten, very far in it. But compared to what is possible with AI today, it's just ridiculously primitive. Now, again, here, as in, I think every one of these areas that I've already touched on, it's perverse how people wind up worrying about the wrong things and going in the wrong direction. So the big worry that you see people having is like, oh, we can't let algorithms make decisions. Algorithms shall not rule us. Decisions made by algorithms are dehumanizing. We can't put people under the control of algorithms. Well, actually, no. We are under the control of an algorithm that is set in the Constitution, and it's an incredibly dumb algorithm. And in fact, so democracy exists and is possible and the rule of law because of writing, right? Before there was writing, the law was the word of the ruler. And so the ruler could do anything they wanted. Now we have laws that the rulers have to obey, and that's great. But this is far from perfect because, first of all, the rulers have cognitive limitations. They can only know their people so well. And even more importantly, because there's an agency problem. What's good for them is not necessarily what's good for the people. But if we take the writing one step further and write the algorithms by which a lot of this works, and those algorithms are inspectable, modifiable, et cetera, agreed on, et cetera, those algorithms potentially overcome those cognitive limitations and those agency problems that the rulers of today and the representatives of today have. So counter to what is in most people's intuition, algorithmic decision making can actually protect your rights and be better for you as a citizen than what we have today that's only based on human agency. So that's another, I think, important area in which a lot of changes might be coming our way and maybe should be coming our way, and we need to think about them. Here's another one, a very popular one these days, social media. And I mean, again, you could talk about a lot of things apropos social media, but let me just touch on one thing. Social media are probably the most important use of AI today because not everyone is aware of this, but most people at this meeting probably are, that, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, et cetera, they use AI systems to choose what to show you, right? So AI is in control of our attention. Right? This is a new phenomenon. Right? What I'm seeing is actually more than anything else determined by these algorithms. And these algorithms are necessary because social media, and the internet underlying them allows communication on a scale that wasn't possible before. So we need AI to make those choices. And now what we have is, again, if you take a solid perspective on this, what we have today is something quite unprecedented, which is the following. Every society that I know of, past and present, has always had social norms. But it has always had areas or places or ways in which you are allowed to escape those social norms. And maybe not get caught, or if you're caught, there's way to be forbidden, and so on and so forth. But those ways usually involve doing things in secret, not doing them in public at least. The thing that is very extraordinary about social media is that it's a public sphere of misbehavior. Everyone misbehaves on social media all the time, right? Another question is like, what do we make of this? And, what should the AI make of this, right? And again, there's an interesting, I think, generational divide in this. But remember, the future is controlled by the new generations, not the old ones, where what the old generations tell the new ones is, be careful. Get your shenanigans off of social media because one day your, drunken antics on Instagram or your politically incorrect posts on Twitter will sink your career, right? But here's another way to look at this, is that we know that misbehavior is normal. Everybody misbehaves some of the time. And the fact, and what's been happening with every successive medium, from books to TV, et cetera, to social media, is that misbehavior is more and more visible and is more and more accepted, right? So Today, there's a lot of misbehavior on TikTok or Twitter or whatever that is, completely trivialized. And so it may be that, let's say you are a Gen Z, person who's going to run for president in 2050, let's say. And then, of course, the journalists and, the oppo research, as they call it, from the other party are going to try to find things to, take you down with. And they're going to, of course, look at your, social media from the last decades. And then let's suppose that you did follow the advice of the older generations who were very careful about never doing anything untoward on social media. Then they will go, oh, this is a very suspicious person. They're too robotic. They're too controlled. They're too calculating. They're not relatable. They're not one of us. We don't want this person for president. So maybe what you should be doing if you want to run for president in a couple of decades' time is to start putting out some engaging content on social media, because maybe in the long run, that'll actually do more good than harm. So last one, let's get a little bit more philosophical. And, this is a favorite question of a lot of people who think about AI and for a very good reason. And it has been, since the beginning. This one is not just a recent phenomenon. And the question is, what distinguishes us from machines, right? So we humans really like to think that we're unique. And we're unique relative to other animals because we have intelligence to a degree that none of them do. But now, of course, AI calls this into question because AI could be as intelligent as us or more. So that one's gone. So now what makes us unique? And what you see people falling back on over and over again is emotions, right? We can have emotions and AI doesn't, which is in itself is kind of ironic because, but again, people have this notion that it's very hard for AIs to understand emotions, behave emotionally, but it's actually the opposite. Emotions are much harder to read and to simulate than intelligence, right? Just ask any owner of a Tamagotchi pet, right? That thing is as dumb as it gets, but it's powerfully emotional. Or think of all the, teenage boys in China that have declared their love for Zhao Weiss, right? The Microsoft bot there that has the persona of a teenage girl, right? Much easier to do Zhao Weiss than it is to do Cortana that actually has to be competent at tasks that require intelligence. But even beyond that, right? The problem is that, well, first of all, animals also have emotions, so that doesn't really work. So it's not emotions, it's not intelligence, so what is it, right? Well, I think sooner or later, we're going to have to face the fact that it's nothing. There is not necessarily anything that makes us different from AI, and why that makes us unique. And why should there be? That doesn't need to be, right? Here's an analogy. What makes a neuron different from a skin cell, right? The DNA is the same, right? I mean, there's the biological process of, development, epigenesis and whatnot, but the point is that they're different, and they're made different during development because they have different functions. And neurons of different types are different because there's a whole, there's hundreds of different types of neurons. They're different because they have different functions in the brain and in the nervous system. And ultimately, that I think is the key difference between humans and AIs. It's not, we can have a lot of interesting discussions about, free will and consciousness and emotions and whatnot. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is that in a future society, humans and AIs will just have different functions. And in particular, our key function, or one of them, is to set the goals. We decide what is desirable, what needs to be done. And the AI's function is to bring those goals about, is to execute them, is to make them happen. And we get to monitor them and we get to check the results, which is actually quite possible, even if the AIs are far more intelligent than us, because the job of an AI, and this is the technical definition, is to solve NP-complete problems using heuristics. And solving the problems is exponentially hard, so the more intelligence you throw at them, the better. But checking the solutions is only polynomial. So checking the solutions is tractable, right? So our job is going to be to check the solutions that the AIs came up with. If you want to cure cancer, you don't want to limit the intelligence of the machine that cures cancer. You want it to be absolutely as intelligent as possible. What you want to do is check that what it's doing is curing cancer and not doing some other thing that you don't want it to do. And that is much, much easier than curing cancer. So, how will this all play out, right? How should you take all of this? As you see, and I mean, again, I just skated on the surface here. There are all these issues that are very, difficult and complex to deal with. And what should your attitude to this be? Well, here's a few attitudes that you could have. One attitude that you could have is the famous saying from, William F. Buckley, famous American conservative, who said that the job of the conservative is to stand athwart history yelling, stop, right? And you could try to do that. You could stand athwart AI yelling, stop, which is what a lot of people are doing today. No more, no less. They're trying to stop AI. But, again, if we look back at history, we know that this doesn't work, right? You can stand athwart history yelling, it stop, but history just moves right past you, right? History is a very big ship. And the ship is, once it's moving, it's very hard to stop or impossible. What you can do is try to steer the ship or help steer the ship. At least, dink it in the right direction. You probably can't stop it dead, but, there's many different directions it could go. And there you actually have some hope of accomplishing something, right? Which brings us to a second possible attitude that you could have to this, which is, well, so, what do we do with AI, right? So, one attitude to this is to sit in our armchairs philosophizing about what AI could do and how we should handle it. And there's a place for that. But another view of this, with which I, as a technologist, sympathize, comes from Alan Kay's, famous saying. And Alan Kay, for those of you who don't know, is like one of the people who invented graphical user interfaces. And, you wouldn't have, Apple computers or iPhones or all of those things, or all of these, graphical interfaces without Alan. And he famously said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So if you want to shape AI, the first step is to create the AIs that do the kinds of things that you want to do with them. And that, in fact, is a very good motivation to develop AI, right? Because the first step in making something happen is
recording stopped. Is making recording in progress.
Right? Then after it's possible, the next step is to figure out what to do with it, right? And this brings us to the third, and I would say most important of ways that you could take this, which is the one that comes from Marx, right? You want to ask yourself, how will AI change society and what should be my role in that? And, Marx was right about some things and wrong about others, but I think, he had some very important insights that continue to be, valid today. One of which is that if you want to understand what the moral principles of a society are, you should look for who has power in that society more than anything else. And similarly, if you want to understand how AI will change society or how technology in general will change society, what you want to look for is who will get more power. Who will AI give more power to? And what do those people want? And that's the way society is going to change, including its social mores and moral principles and ethics and so on. Right? And then you want to ask yourself, and this is the final question that I want to leave you with. So who is AI going to give more power to? Is it going to give more power to you? If not, then what should you do about it? And if yes, what are you going to do with that power? Thank you.